Megan, I've been obsessed my whole life about whether there's a God, and to do that, I've always wanted to find what is this God I'm trying to figure out whether that God exists. And one of the great probes is the question of the relationship between God and time. It really, as you get into it, you need to understand the characteristics of God that relate to it.
Yeah.
You've written extensively and really are an expert on the concept of time. So briefly give me an overview of the A theory and B theory, and then how an understanding of the nature of time can affect our understanding of God, if there is a God.
Sure. So one of the major distinctions in the metaphysics of time is between philosophers who believe that there's a real difference between the past and the present and the future. These are usually called the A theorists. That's just a holdover from this philosopher McTaggart, who had very boring names for the distinction. The A theorists believe in the past, present, future distinction. B theorists think of time more as like a spread out manifold, where each bit of the manifold is an instant, and some happen earlier and some happen later, but there's really no important difference other than that. So there's no way to take time, if you imagine it kind of spread out like this carpet, there's no way to chop it up into this part is objectively the past, this part's objectively the future. Instead, you just look at each particular time and ask, what happened earlier than that time? That's that time's past. What happened later than that time? That's that time's future. But if we go anywhere else, what's going to count as the past and the future is going to be relative to which time we're pinpointing it to.
Right.
That's called the B theory. I'm very sympathetic with the A theory of time. You know, there's a raging debate about whether our best physical theories entail that the B theory is right or the A theory is right. That, I take it, is still very much a live debate in philosophy of physics, and it might be that physics gives us a picture of time that just doesn't even fit any of these distinctions. I think for now, philosophers do really important work by just explaining what it would be to take the past and the present and the future seriously. And I think the verdict is still out about whether the A theory is right. Big part of my work is trying to think about what exactly we're talking about when we talk about there being a past and being a future. What kinds of changes would happen in a world that had a real past, present, and future? And how would that theory help us understand, one, like what kinds of things we are? So, like on the B theory of time, whatever people are spread out in this big manifold. One way we talk about it with our students is they're kind of like worms that are spread out in the manifold. And you've got parts of your life that exist back in the past. They're still just as much real in their own times. That's your childhood. Parts of your life, your future, your death, are still just as much real in their part of the manifold. They're actually happening. They're just events at these other times. And there's this event that's happening right now. I've never found that a really compelling picture of what kind of thing I am.
Certainly it's not common sense is the way that our own way we look at the world, but there is an argument from general relativity that there is this block universe, and that's part of the space-time manifold. And so there are modern physics corroborations of that B-time theory, although that theory of general relativity, everybody recognizes, is not the final theory. There's something sitting below it, and who knows what. So the verdict is definitely out. But the B-time does have physical corroborations.
Yeah, I think one of the most serious arguments for the B theory is this idea that in relativistic contexts, special relativity, general relativity is a little bit more confusing just because there's so many versions of that theory now. But in the relativistic context, physics doesn't seem to need a present. In fact, it doesn't even have a way of like really precisely specifying what the present would be. So then you have this question as a philosopher: if one of the concepts that you take seriously in your ordinary thinking doesn't have a place in physics anymore, does that mean that the concept really doesn't have any philosophical value anymore? Or does it mean that it's not real, or there's nothing to back it up? When are our concepts just turning out to be biases? And when do they turn out to be something that maybe has philosophical importance or can get evidence from other sources, but isn't something that's a part of our best physical theory?
Okay, now with all that uncertainty, apply it to God.
So then there's a God question. I don't know, one of the biggest debates, obviously, in philosophy of religion is you've got these two models of how time might work for us. Question one, is God in any of these models? Like, does it make sense to have an A theory God or a B theory God? You might think none of this makes any sense. So a version of atemporalism is like, whatever our time is, God is completely independent of it. when I think of this, I think of like, if you've got the block universe theory of time, we've got the block here, and God's like this just little dot that's hovering over it, and he kind of sees everything spread out in a way that we can't perceive because we're locked in our own times. But he sees the whole manifold. Or if the A theory is right, God sees this kind of like waves of time or passage as they're occurring, but he's seeing it as though it's like, the stills in a film reel and not watching the film as it's dynamically passing. So that's the atemporalist view. I have to admit, as a philosopher and as somebody who believes in God, I've never found that atemporalist picture of God particularly compelling for a couple of reasons. One, I think the defenders of the atemporalist view think
that God is not in time.
That God's outside of time somehow.
Yeah.
Think that when you try to describe this to someone, you're like, God's out here and he's looking down on space and time as like something outside of himself. And when you imagine God doing that, you imagine him in a perspective, like, thinking or looking or perceiving, whichever way God perceives, which is obviously quite different from how we perceive it. This idea for me of somebody like perceiving outside of time or without having his own standpoint or his own time, I have a hard time conceptualizing what the people who think God is outside of time are talking about when they give me that picture. And at the end of the day, philosophy is not just all about giving compelling pictures, but that's a good part of offering a good philosophical theory, is giving somebody an analogy or a model for how something would work. I think it makes much more sense to think of God as occupying a perspective, which already gets you a little bit of the way into God being in some kind of time. Now you have this question of whether God's in his own time, like his own divine present, or whether in a certain sense our time is something that also God is a part of. And that I think is a much harder issue. Again, I'm an atheist, so I'm very compelled by the idea that there's this difference between the past and the present and the future. One thing that's true about the future for us is it's like radically open, or it strikes us as extremely open. Am I gonna go to dinner tonight, or am I gonna stay home? Am I gonna accept a bribe if you offer it to me after this interview or not? It seems like all of those things are unsettled. God, presumably, whatever the future is in our metaphysical picture, he knows all of it because he has perfect knowledge. It's part of just believing in an omniscient God. So what could it be if the future is real and the whole nature of the future is to be unsettled in this way? What would it mean for God to have perfect knowledge of it if he occupies the time the way we do? I think that's a significant puzzle, and it obviously raises interesting questions for our freedom. If we think that God's in the same time as we are, he knows whether I'm going to accept the bribe. He knows exactly what I'm going to eat for dinner tonight. He knows the day I'm going to die. He knows who the 2020 presidential candidacy winner is going to be. If he knows all those things, I assume the future is radically open. It seems like these two pictures of the future are just radically incompatible. That's an issue I definitely struggle with.